Imagine waking up one morning in the year 1519, and you're standing in the middle of what might be the most incredible city anyone has ever seen. We're talking about a place that would make Rome look like a sleepy suburb. A metropolis built on a lake. Yeah, you heard that right, on a lake. With causeways stretching for miles, floating gardens that fed 250,000 people, and pyramids so tall they pierced the clouds. This was Tenochtitlan, the crown jewel of the Aztec Empire, and it sat right where Mexico City stands today. But here's the wild part. In just 2 short years, this unstoppable empire would crumble, and from its ashes would rise something entirely new. The story of how Mexico came to be? It's not just history, folks. It's one of the most dramatic, unexpected, and honestly mind-bending tales of transformation the world has ever witnessed. So let's rewind the clock a bit, because to understand Mexico, we need to talk about the Aztecs. But hold on. Aztecs is actually not even what they called themselves. They were the Mexica people, pronounced Mexica, and that's where the word Mexico actually comes from. Now that's a fun fact you can drop at your next dinner party. These folks weren't native to the Valley of Mexico either. They were wanderers, nomads who came down from somewhere up north, maybe what we'd now call the southwestern United States, and they arrived in central Mexico around the year 1300. And get this, they were basically the new kids in town that nobody wanted around. The other city-states in the area looked at them like, who are these guys showing up with nothing? They were forced to settle on a swampy, mosquito-infested island in the middle of Lake Texcoco because literally nobody else wanted that land. But here's where it gets interesting. The Mexica had this prophecy, this vision from their god Huitzilopochtli. Try saying that 5 times fast. And the prophecy said they should build their city where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. And supposedly they saw exactly that on this marshy island. Now whether they actually saw it or just really needed to convince themselves that this swamp was their promised land, we'll never know. But they committed to it, and within just 200 years they transformed that unwanted island into the largest, most powerful empire in Mesoamerica. That's like going from living in your parents' basement to owning a penthouse in Manhattan in record time. The Aztecs, or Mexica, had this genius agricultural system called Chinampas. Think of them as floating gardens, but they weren't really floating. They were more like raised garden beds built in the shallow parts of the lake. They'd drive wooden stakes into the lake bed, weave them together with reeds, and pile up mud and vegetation until they had these super fertile rectangular plots. The roots would eventually anchor into the lake bed, and boom, you've got permanent farmland surrounded by water. It was brilliant. These Chinampas could produce up to 7 harvests a year. 7. Most places were lucky to get 1 or 2. This system allowed them to feed hundreds of thousands of people in a city that had no business being that big. Now, Tenochtitlan wasn't just impressive because of the food production. The city itself was a marvel of urban planning that would make modern city planners weep with envy. They had a grid system with streets and canals. Some you could walk, others you'd paddle through in a canoe. Fresh water was brought in through a sophisticated aqueduct system from springs miles away. They even had a kind of garbage collection and street cleaning service. Public sanitation was such a priority that the Spanish conquistadors, when they first arrived, were shocked. European cities at the time were basically open sewers. People just threw their waste into the streets. But in Tenochtitlan, there were public bathrooms, there were cleaners. The Aztecs took thousands of baths compared to Europeans who might bathe once a year if they were feeling fancy. The centerpiece of the city was the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, this massive stepped pyramid that dominated the skyline. It was dedicated to 2 gods, Huitzilopochtli, the war god, and Tlaloc, the rain god. And this wasn't just one temple. It was actually layers of temples built on top of each other over generations, like a giant archaeological layer cake. Every time a new ruler came to power, they'd often add another layer, making it bigger and more impressive. When the Spanish first saw it, they estimated it was about 150 feet tall. That's like a 15-story building, and this was in the 1500s, built without cranes or modern technology. But let's talk about the empire itself. The Aztecs didn't just control one city. At their height, they dominated an area roughly the size of Ireland, with somewhere between 5 and 6 million people under their influence. But here's the thing. They didn't really conquer and occupy territories the way the Romans did. They had a more, let's call it a tribute-based business model. They'd show up with their army, make it very clear that resistance was futile, and then set up a tribute system. Local rulers could keep their positions, keep their customs, keep their languages. They just had to pay up regularly. We're talking about cotton, cacao beans, precious feathers, gold, jaguar skins, you name it. And if you didn't pay, well, let's just say the Aztec military would come back with a friendly reminder. And trust me, you didn't want that reminder. Here's something wild though. The Aztecs never actually invented the wheel for transportation. They knew about wheels. Archaeologists have found little toy animals with wheels on them, but they never scaled it up for carts or anything practical. Why? Probably because they didn't have horses, oxen, or any large animals to pull carts. In Mesoamerica, the biggest beast of burden was basically a human. Everything was moved by people carrying stuff on their backs or in canoes. So in a weird way, not having draft animals meant the wheel just wasn't that useful to them. It's one of those historical quirks that makes you realize how different circumstances lead to totally different innovations. Now, the Aztecs get a pretty dark reputation in history, and we need to address the elephant in the room. They practiced ritual ceremonies that involved human offerings to their gods. This was absolutely a real part of their culture, and it's documented in their own writings, in Spanish accounts, and in archaeological evidence. But here's what often gets lost. This wasn't random cruelty. In their worldview, the universe was constantly under threat of ending. The gods had created and destroyed the world 4 times already, and they believed they were living in the 5th sun, the 5th world. The gods required nourishment to keep the sun rising and the world functioning. It sounds wild to us, but to them, this was cosmic maintenance. They genuinely believed they were preventing the apocalypse. And get this, many of the people chosen for these ceremonies were actually volunteers or prisoners from warfare, and there are accounts suggesting some saw it as an honor. The Aztec religion was incredibly complex, with a pantheon of hundreds of gods, each governing different aspects of life. Tlaloc governed rain and fertility. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, represented wind and learning. Tezcatlipoca was the god of night and sorcery. Every part of life had a divine aspect, and the Aztecs spent enormous amounts of time and resources on religious ceremonies, festivals, and maintaining their relationship with the divine. The Aztec education system is another thing that doesn't get enough credit. They had mandatory education for all children. Everyone. Rich kids, poor kids, boys and girls. There were different schools depending on social class, but everyone learned. Commoner children attended schools called Telpachcali, where boys learned warfare, agriculture, and trades, while girls learned domestic skills and textile production. But both learned history, songs, and moral conduct. Noble children attended Kalmakak schools, where the curriculum was more intense. Philosophy, astronomy, poetry, law, and theology. The goal was to produce well-rounded citizens who understood their place in society and the cosmos. Compare that to Europe at the same time, where most people were completely illiterate and education was reserved for the wealthy elite and clergy. The Aztec economy was fascinating too. They didn't have coined money like Europe, but they had a sophisticated system of trade and barter. Cacao beans were used as a kind of currency for smaller transactions. A rabbit might cost you 10 cacao beans. A turkey could run you 100. They had massive markets. The one in Tlatelolco, which was technically a separate city but basically Tenochtitlan's twin, had up to 60,000 people visiting on market days. You could find everything there: jade, obsidian blades, feathers from tropical birds, jewelry, textiles, pottery, food of every kind imaginable. The Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote that the market was more organized and had more variety than any market in Europe, including those in Constantinople or Rome. That's high praise from someone who was literally there to conquer them. Now here's where our story takes a massive turn. It's 1519, and a Spanish expedition led by a guy named Hernán Cortés lands on the eastern coast of Mexico. Cortés was in his 30s, ambitious, and honestly kind of a rogue. He wasn't even supposed to be leading this expedition. He basically hijacked it from his superior in Cuba and set off before he could be stopped. Talk about making a career move. He had about 600 men, 16 horses, and 13 ships. Those horses, by the way, were a huge deal because the indigenous people of Mexico had never seen horses before. Imagine if aliens landed tomorrow riding something we'd never even conceived of. That's the kind of shock we're talking about. Cortés landed in what's now Veracruz, and pretty quickly he made a decision that shows you how committed he was to this mission. He burned his own ships. Well, technically he had them stripped and scuttled, but the point is, there was no going back. It was succeed or perish. No plan B, no escape route. His men were stuck on the mainland, and the only way forward was toward Tenochtitlan. Now you might be wondering how 600 guys managed to even make it to the capital, let alone threaten an empire of millions. And that's where the story gets really complicated and really interesting. See, the Aztecs had built their empire through military might and tribute, which meant they had a lot of conquered peoples who weren't exactly thrilled about the arrangement. When Cortés started making his way inland, he encountered indigenous groups who saw the Spanish as potential allies against their Aztec overlords. The Totonacs were one of the first major groups to side with Cortés. They hated paying tribute to Tenochtitlan. Then came the big one, the Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcala was this independent state completely surrounded by Aztec territory. They'd been enemies with the Aztecs for generations, constantly at war, constantly under pressure. When Cortés showed up, the Tlaxcalans initially fought against the Spanish. They weren't about to trust these strange foreigners right away, but after a series of battles where the Spanish demonstrated their weapons and tactics, the Tlaxcalans made a calculated decision. Enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? They became Cortés's most important allies, and they brought thousands of warriors with them. So by the time Cortés reached Tenochtitlan, he had a coalition force that was significantly larger and more formidable than his original expedition. There's also this incredible woman who played a crucial role in all this. Her indigenous name was Malinche, but the Spanish called her Doña Marina, and in Mexican history, she's known as La Malinche. She was given to the Spanish as part of a tribute from a local chief, and she spoke both Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and Maya. She learned Spanish incredibly quickly and became Cortés's translator and advisor. Without her, Cortés would have been completely lost. He wouldn't have understood the political landscape, the cultural nuances, or been able to negotiate with anyone. La Malinche's role is super controversial in Mexican history. Some see her as a traitor, others as a survivor making the best of an impossible situation. She's become this symbolic figure representing the mixing of Spanish and indigenous cultures that would eventually create modern Mexico. When Cortés and his coalition finally reached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, it was a moment of pure spectacle. The Aztec emperor at the time was Moctezuma II. Some people say Montezuma, but it's actually Moctezuma. He was in a really difficult position. There was this prophecy or legend about Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who had supposedly left Mexico centuries earlier, promising to return from the east. And here come these bearded strangers from the east, with weapons and animals nobody had ever seen. Some sources suggest Moctezuma thought Cortés might be the god returning, though modern historians debate how much this actually influenced his decisions. What's clear is that Moctezuma was cautious and uncertain about how to handle this situation. Rather than attacking immediately, Moctezuma invited Cortés and his men into the city as guests. This turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. The Spanish and their allies entered Tenochtitlan via one of the great causeways, and by all accounts, they were absolutely stunned by what they saw. Remember, these guys came from Spain, which had nice cities, sure, but nothing like this. Tenochtitlan was estimated to have between 200,000 and 300,000 residents, making it one of the largest cities in the entire world at that time. Bigger than Paris, bigger than London. The Spanish couldn't believe their eyes. The canals, the gardens, the palaces, the temples. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the conquistador who wrote extensively about the conquest, said some of the soldiers wondered if they were dreaming. They'd literally never imagined a city like this could exist. Moctezuma housed the Spanish in a palace, treated them with hospitality, and showered them with gifts. But Cortés, being the opportunist he was, sensed vulnerability. In an incredibly bold move, he took Moctezuma hostage. Just grabbed the emperor of the most powerful empire in the region and held him prisoner. And here's the crazy part. Moctezuma seemed to go along with it. He continued to govern from captivity, insisting to his people that he was staying with the Spanish voluntarily. Historians still debate why he acted this way. Was he paralyzed by indecision? Did he still think Cortés might be divine? Was he playing a longer game we don't fully understand? We'll never know for sure. The situation in Tenochtitlan remained tense but relatively stable for months. But then, things went absolutely sideways. Cortés had to leave the city temporarily to deal with a Spanish force sent from Cuba to arrest him for that whole unauthorized expedition thing. He left one of his lieutenants, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge, and Alvarado, let's just say he wasn't known for his diplomatic skills. During a religious festival where Aztec nobles were gathered in the Templo Mayor courtyard, unarmed and in the middle of ceremony, Alvarado ordered his men to attack them. The exact reasons why are disputed. Some say he thought they were planning an uprising, others say it was a preemptive strike, and some cynical historians suggest it was just an opportunity for plunder. Whatever the reason, it was a massacre. Hundreds of the Aztec nobility were lost in a matter of hours. When word of this atrocity spread through the city, the people of Tenochtitlan absolutely erupted in fury. By the time Cortés rushed back to the city, the Spanish and their allies were basically under siege inside the palace. The Aztecs had torn up the causeways, cutting off escape routes. They were attacking day and night, and the Spanish position was becoming increasingly desperate. Moctezuma tried to calm his people, speaking to them from the palace walls, but they were done listening to him. Some accounts say the people threw stones and arrows, and Moctezuma was struck and injured. Shortly after, he passed away. Whether it was from these injuries or something else is another historical mystery that's never been definitively solved. With Moctezuma gone, the Spanish knew they had to get out of Tenochtitlan immediately. What followed was one of the most disastrous retreats in military history. On the night of June 30th, 1520, known as La Noche Triste, the Sad Night, Cortés and his forces tried to sneak out of the city under cover of darkness. They loaded themselves down with as much gold and treasure as they could carry. Big mistake. The Aztecs discovered them, and all-out chaos erupted. The Spanish were caught on the causeways, trapped between the lake and a furious Aztec army. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 600 and 860 Spanish soldiers and several thousand indigenous allies lost their lives that night. Many drowned in the lake, dragged down by the gold they'd refused to abandon. Cortés himself barely escaped and allegedly sat under a tree afterward and wept. Even in defeat, the guy had a flair for the dramatic. But here's where the story takes its most devastating turn, and it has nothing to do with warfare. While the Spanish were regrouping and planning their comeback, an invisible enemy was already at work. The conquistadors had unknowingly brought smallpox to the Americas. This disease had ravaged Europe for centuries, and Europeans had some level of immunity, or at least survival mechanisms. But the indigenous peoples of the Americas had never been exposed to it. They had zero immunity. Zero. The epidemic that followed was catastrophic beyond comprehension. Some estimates suggest that up to 40% of the population of Tenochtitlan perished within a year. The new emperor, Cuitlahuac, who had taken over after Moctezuma, succumbed to the disease just 80 days into his reign. The social fabric was coming apart. People couldn't bury their loved ones fast enough. Markets closed. Agriculture collapsed. The city was in complete crisis. While the Aztecs were reeling from the epidemic, Cortés was rebuilding his forces. He got reinforcements from Cuba, recruited more indigenous allies who were eager to see the Aztec Empire fall, and he came up with a brilliant but brutal plan. He couldn't fight the Aztecs effectively on the causeways or in the city itself. That much was clear from the sad night. So he decided to build ships. Right there on the shore of Lake Texcoco, the Spanish constructed 13 brigantines, small sailing vessels with mounted cannons. It took months, but when he was ready, Cortés had control of the lake. He could cut off supplies coming into the city by water, and he could attack from unexpected angles. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May 1521 and lasted for 75 days. It was brutal. The Spanish and their indigenous allies, which now numbered in the hundreds of thousands, surrounded the city and slowly strangled it. They cut off fresh water. They blocked food supplies. They bombarded the city with cannons from their ships. The defenders, led by the young Emperor Cuauhtémoc, who was only in his 20s, fought with incredible courage and desperation. But they were weakened by disease, starvation, and lack of resources. Building by building, street by street, the Spanish and their allies ground forward. By August 1521, the once magnificent Tenochtitlan was in ruins. On August 13th, Cuauhtémoc was captured trying to escape across the lake, and that was effectively the end of the Aztec Empire. Let that sink in for a second. In just 2 years, from 1519 to 1521, one of the world's great empires, an empire that had dominated its region for nearly 2 centuries, was gone, completely transformed. Tenochtitlan, that shining city on the lake, lay in ruins. The conquistadors systematically destroyed the temples, the palaces, everything that represented the old order. They filled in canals, tore down pyramids, and used the stones to build Spanish colonial buildings. The Templo Mayor was dismantled, and the Mexico City Cathedral, which still stands today, was built partly with stones from that great pyramid. It's like a physical metaphor for what happened to the culture itself. The old buried beneath the new. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because what happened next wasn't just Spanish replacing Aztec. It was way more complicated than that. The Spanish didn't have nearly enough people to run an empire this size by themselves. They needed the existing administrative structures, the local leaders, the tribute systems, all of it. So what emerged was this hybrid system. The Spanish established the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1535, with Mexico City as its capital, built literally on top of Tenochtitlan. But they relied heavily on indigenous nobles to govern local areas. Many of these nobles converted to Christianity, learned Spanish, and served as intermediaries between the Spanish crown and the indigenous population. It wasn't a clean conquest and replacement. It was a messy, complicated blending of cultures, systems, and peoples. And let's talk about that blending because this is where Mexico really starts to emerge as its own unique thing. The Spanish brought their language, their religion, their legal systems, their architecture, but they couldn't erase the indigenous cultures. And honestly, many didn't even try to completely. What developed was this cultural fusion called mestizaje, Spanish men, and there were way more men than women in the early colonial period, married or partnered with indigenous women. Their children, called mestizos, were literally mixed heritage. Over generations, this mixing continued and expanded. African slaves were brought over, adding another layer to the mix. Asian goods and people arrived via the Manila galleon trade route, because Spain's empire was so vast that Mexico became this incredible crossroads of world cultures. Mexican food today is a perfect example of this fusion. Yeah, tacos existed before the Spanish. The indigenous peoples ate corn tortillas with various fillings. But then the Spanish brought pigs, beef, chicken, cheese, wheat, rice, and spices from Asia. Mexican cuisine took all of that and created something entirely new. Mole, one of Mexico's most famous dishes, combines indigenous chilies and chocolate with Spanish and Asian spices. It takes literally dozens of ingredients and hours to prepare properly. That's not Spanish food. That's not indigenous food. That's Mexican food. Something new, born from the collision and combination of different worlds. The same thing happened with religion. The Spanish were devout Catholics and immediately set about converting the indigenous population. Franciscan, Dominican, and Augustinian friars fanned out across the territory, building missions and churches. But the indigenous people didn't just abandon their old beliefs entirely. They incorporated elements of their traditional spirituality into Catholic practice. The Virgin of Guadalupe is the perfect example. According to legend, in 1531, the Virgin Mary appeared to an indigenous man named Juan Diego on a hill that had been sacred to Tonantzin, an Aztec mother goddess. The image that miraculously appeared on Juan Diego's cloak showed Mary with indigenous features standing on a crescent moon, which had symbolic meaning in Aztec cosmology. The Catholic Church embraced this, and the Virgin of Guadalupe became the patron saint of Mexico. Today, she's arguably more important to Mexican identity than any other single symbol. That's religious syncretism in action. The colonial period, which lasted from 1521 to 1821, 300 years, was marked by this constant tension between Spanish control and Mexican identity formation. The Spanish crown established a strict caste system based on racial heritage. At the top were the peninsulares, people born in Spain. These guys held all the top positions in government and church, even if they just arrived last week. Below them were the criollos, people of pure Spanish descent but born in the Americas. And here's where it gets interesting. The criollos might have been wealthy, educated, owned vast estates, but they could never quite reach the top. It didn't matter if your family had been in Mexico for 5 generations. If you weren't born in Spain, there was a ceiling on your advancement. Talk about frustrating. Then came the mestizos, the mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage folks, then indigenous peoples, then African slaves and their descendants, and various other mixed categories with incredibly specific names. There was a whole system of castas paintings. These were actually made as artworks, showing different racial combinations and what you'd call the children. Spanish plus indigenous equals mestizo. Mestizo plus Spanish equals castizo. Mulatto plus Spanish equals morisco. It went on and on with literally dozens of categories. Your position in this hierarchy determined what jobs you could have, who you could marry, where you could live, what clothes you could wear. It was rigid and oppressive, but it also created this intensely stratified society where everyone was acutely aware of their identity and position. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The role of the Catholic Church in shaping colonial Mexico. The church wasn't just about religion. It was the biggest landowner in New Spain. It ran the schools and universities. It controlled huge amounts of wealth through donations and bequests. Wealthy families would endow the church with property to ensure prayers for their souls. The church ran hospitals, orphanages, and charitable institutions. If you needed a loan, you might go to the church. It was deeply woven into every aspect of life. The missions were particularly important in frontier areas, places like California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Yeah, those were all part of New Spain, were colonized primarily through missions. Franciscan friars would establish a mission, gather indigenous people there, teach them Christianity and Spanish, and set up farming and ranching operations. The Mission San Xavier del Bac near Tucson, Arizona, or the California missions like San Juan Capistrano are still standing today. These weren't just churches, they were complete communities, agricultural centers, and tools of cultural transformation. The missionaries genuinely believed they were saving souls, but they were also agents of colonization, deliberately breaking down indigenous cultures and replacing them with Spanish Catholic culture. The economy of New Spain was incredibly diverse, way more than people realize. Yes, silver mining was huge, but there was also agriculture, ranching, textile production, sugar plantations, indigo production for dye, cochineal insects harvested for red dye that was incredibly valuable in Europe. The hacienda system developed where wealthy landowners controlled vast estates worked by indigenous laborers. Some haciendas were like self-contained worlds with thousands of workers, their own churches, stores, everything. The workers were often bound by debt peonage. They owed money to the hacienda store, could never quite pay it off, and so remained tied to the land generation after generation. It was exploitation dressed up as economics. The Spanish extracted incredible wealth from Mexico, primarily through silver mining. The silver mines of Mexico, especially places like Zacatecas and Guanajuato, produced such vast quantities of silver that they fundamentally changed the global economy. Spanish silver coins minted in Mexico City became the de facto international currency for centuries. You could use them in the Philippines, in China, in Europe, in India. But here's the thing, very little of that wealth stayed in Mexico. It flowed back to Spain, or it was used to finance Spain's endless European wars. The people actually doing the mining, often indigenous workers forced into labor under systems that were barely different from slavery. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists the labor of indigenous people in exchange for supposedly providing them protection and religious instruction. In practice, it was brutal exploitation. But Mexico wasn't static during these 3 centuries. Cities grew, universities were founded, arts and literature flourished. The University of Mexico was established in 1551, making it one of the oldest universities in the Americas. Mexican Baroque architecture developed its own distinctive style, more ornate and exuberant than its European counterpart. Artists like Cristobal de Villalpando and Juan Correa created stunning religious paintings that combined European techniques with local sensibilities. Writers documented the history, nature, and peoples of New Spain. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a nun and intellectual in the 1600s, wrote poetry and plays that challenged social norms and defended women's right to education. She's considered one of the greatest writers in the Spanish language. The point is, even under colonial rule, a distinct Mexican culture was developing, one that was neither Spanish nor indigenous, but something genuinely new. By the early 1800s, tensions were building. Spain was in trouble, Napoleon had invaded, and the Spanish crown was in chaos. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the criollos were getting increasingly frustrated. They were educated, wealthy, often more numerous than the peninsulares, but they were still treated as second-class citizens. They couldn't hold the highest government or church positions. They resented that all the profits from Mexican resources went to Spain. Enlightenment ideas about liberty, equality, and self-governance were spreading. The American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789 had shown that colonial powers could be challenged and overthrown. The stage was set for something big. And then, in 1810, it happened. A priest named Miguel Hidalgo, in the small town of Dolores, issued what's known as the Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Dolores. On the morning of September 16, 1810, Hidalgo rang his church bell and called his parishioners together. He delivered a speech calling for Mexican independence from Spain, for the end of Spanish rule, for equality and land reform. The exact words of his speech are lost to history, but its impact was immediate. Thousands of people, mostly poor mestizos and indigenous folks, rallied to his cause. Hidalgo led this growing army toward Mexico City, and within weeks, he had tens of thousands of followers. September 16th is now celebrated as Mexican Independence Day. But here's the thing. Hidalgo's revolt was chaotic and ultimately unsuccessful in the short term. His army was untrained and poorly equipped. They won some early battles but were eventually defeated by royalist forces. Hidalgo was captured in 1811 and executed, but the movement didn't end there. Other leaders took up the cause. José María Morelos, another priest, continued the fight with better organization and military strategy. He managed to control large parts of southern Mexico and even convened a Congress that drafted a constitution. But he too was eventually captured and executed in 1815. By 1816, the independence movement seemed crushed. The Spanish crown had reasserted control, and rebellion was smoldering but not blazing. What reignited everything was, ironically, events back in Spain. In 1820, a liberal revolution in Spain forced the king to accept a constitution that limited his power and reduced the influence of the Catholic Church. The conservative elites in Mexico, the wealthy criollos, the church hierarchy, the military officers, were horrified. They didn't want liberalism spreading to Mexico, so they made a calculated decision. If independence from Spain meant they could preserve their privileges and the traditional social order, then they were all for it. This is where Agustín de Iturbide enters the picture. Iturbide was a criollo military officer who had actually fought against the independence rebels for years. But in 1821, he switched sides and crafted the Plan of Iguala, which laid out a path to independence that was designed to appeal to everybody. It guaranteed independence, Catholicism as the state religion, and equality between peninsulares and criollos. It was a conservative independence, not the radical social revolution that Hidalgo and Morelos had envisioned. In September 1821, Iturbide triumphantly entered Mexico City, and Spain, weakened and distracted by its own problems, didn't really fight it. On September 27, 1821, Mexican independence became official. Just like that, after 300 years of colonial rule, Mexico was its own nation. But becoming independent and becoming a stable, functioning country are two very different things. Initially, Iturbide declared Mexico an empire, and he crowned himself Emperor Agustín I. Yeah, right after breaking free from a monarchy, they immediately set up another monarchy. It didn't last. Iturbide was wildly unpopular, the empire was broke, and he was forced to abdicate after less than a year. He briefly tried to return from exile and was promptly executed. Not a great retirement plan. In 1824, Mexico became a federal republic, modeled somewhat after the United States. They adopted a constitution, set up a Congress, established states with significant autonomy. But the early decades of the Mexican Republic were rough, really rough. The country cycled through governments like people change socks. Between 1821 and 1876, Mexico had more than 50 different presidents or heads of state. Some served for days, most served for months. The presidency changed hands through elections, coups, rebellions, and everything in between. There were constant battles between liberals who wanted a secular federal government and conservatives who wanted a centralized state with the Catholic Church playing a major role. This wasn't just philosophical disagreement. It was about power, money, and control. The Church owned massive amounts of land and wealth. Should that be broken up? Should religious orders be dissolved? Should education be secular? These were fighting questions, literally. Battles were fought over these issues. One guy kept popping up during this chaotic period, Antonio López de Santa Anna. This dude was president 11 different times. 11. He'd get overthrown, come back, get overthrown again, come back again. He was a fascinating character, incredibly ambitious, skilled militarily, but also kind of ridiculous. He lost his leg in battle with the French and later had a state funeral for that leg. A funeral for his leg. He also lost the leg a second time when it was captured by Americans during the Mexican-American War, and it ended up in an Illinois museum. You can't make this stuff up. Santa Anna is famously the commander who was defeated at San Jacinto during the Texas Revolution, while according to some accounts he was taking a siesta. His reputation in Mexico is complicated. The military became incredibly powerful during this period because it was often the only institution that could maintain any kind of order. Army generals became kingmakers or just made themselves kings. The constant instability bankrupted the government repeatedly. Mexico defaulted on its foreign debts, which gave European powers excuses to intervene. Spain tried to reconquer Mexico in 1829 but failed. France blockaded Veracruz in the Pastry War. Yes, it was actually called that because a French pastry chef claimed Mexican officers had ruined his shop and occupied the city until Mexico paid compensation. The country was constantly vulnerable, constantly scrambling. And then there were the external pressures. Texas, which was part of Mexico, had been settled by American immigrants who chafed under Mexican authority. Mexico had actually invited American settlers in the 1820s, offering them cheap land if they'd become Mexican citizens and Catholic. The idea was to populate and develop the northern frontier. But here's what Mexico didn't anticipate. These American settlers kept their American identity and brought their slaves with them. See, Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, but the Texas settlers got exemptions. They vastly outnumbered the Mexican population in Texas, and they increasingly resisted Mexican laws and taxes. When Santa Anna became president and tried to centralize power, dissolving state legislatures and enforcing Mexican law, the Texans rebelled. In 1836, they declared independence, leading to the Texas Revolution. The famous Battle of the Alamo happened during this conflict, where a small group of Texans, including Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, held out against a much larger Mexican force before ultimately being defeated. Remember the Alamo became a rallying cry. Weeks later, Sam Houston's army caught Santa Anna's forces by surprise at San Jacinto and won a decisive victory. Santa Anna was captured and forced to sign treaties recognizing Texas independence, though the Mexican government never accepted this. For nearly a decade, Texas was an independent republic, but everyone knew it was angling to join the United States. When the U.S. finally annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico considered it an act of aggression. Mexico had never recognized Texas independence in the first place, so from their perspective, the U.S. had just stolen their territory. Tensions were already high over the exact border. Was it the Nueces River, as Mexico claimed, or the Rio Grande, as Texas claimed? President James K. Polk, an expansionist who wanted California and New Mexico, was looking for a fight. He sent troops into the disputed territory, and when Mexican forces attacked them, Polk declared that Mexico had invaded American territory and shed American blood on American soil. Congress declared war, though it was controversial, even in the United States. Abraham Lincoln, then a young congressman, challenged Polk to show the exact spot where American blood had been shed on American soil. Many Northerners opposed the war because they saw it as a Southern plot to expand slavery. But the war went ahead anyway, and it was a disaster for Mexico. The U.S. military, better equipped and organized, won battle after battle. They invaded from multiple directions, from Texas toward Monterrey and Saltillo, from New Mexico toward California, and in the crucial campaign, General Winfield Scott landed at Veracruz and marched overland to Mexico City, basically retracing the route Cortés had taken 300 years earlier. American forces occupied Mexico City in September 1847. The Mexican government fled to Querétaro and continued to resist, but the writing was on the wall. Negotiations dragged on for months. Some American expansionists wanted to take all of Mexico. Seriously, there was a movement called All Mexico that argued the U.S. should just annex the entire country. Others opposed this on racist grounds, arguing that Mexicans were too racially mixed and Catholic to be integrated into the United States. Ultimately, they settled on taking about half. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which forced Mexico to cede huge portions of its territory. We're talking present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, to the United States for $15 million. Mexico lost about half of its territory in one fell swoop. About 100,000 Mexicans living in those territories suddenly found themselves in the United States without ever moving. They could stay and become Americans or move south of the new border. It was a humiliating defeat that's still remembered with bitterness. In Mexico, they call this war La Intervención Estadounidense, the American intervention. The defeat sparked serious soul-searching about why Mexico had lost so badly. Was it the political instability, the military weakness, the corruption? This trauma would shape Mexican politics and psychology for generations. As if that wasn't enough, just a few years later, Mexico went through a devastating civil war called the Reform War in the late 1850s, followed by a French invasion in the 1860s. France, under Napoleon III, actually installed an Austrian prince, Maximilian, as Emperor of Mexico with backing from Mexican conservatives. It was this bizarre colonial throwback, but Mexican liberals, led by Benito Juárez, one of Mexico's greatest heroes, fought back. Juárez was indigenous Zapotec, a lawyer who rose to the presidency, and he refused to give up even when it looked hopeless. After years of fighting, the French withdrew, Maximilian was captured and executed, and Juárez triumphantly returned to Mexico City in 1867. This period solidified many liberal reforms: separation of church and state, limits on church property, secular education. These were huge transformations. The late 1800s brought a long period of dictatorial stability under Porfirio Diaz, who ruled from 1876 to 1911 with only one brief interruption. The Porfiriato, as it's called, brought economic growth, railroads, modernization. Mexico looked impressive on paper, but this prosperity was concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, while the vast majority of Mexicans remained impoverished, landless, and exploited. It was a powder keg. In 1910, that powder keg exploded into the Mexican Revolution, one of the most significant and complex revolutions of the 20th century. Francisco Madero called for Diaz to step down and for democratic elections. When Diaz refused, the country erupted into armed conflict. Over the next decade, Mexico was torn apart by competing factions. Emiliano Zapata in the south fought for land reform with the slogan Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. Pancho Villa in the north led a powerful revolutionary army. There were betrayals, changing alliances, and enormous transformation. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million people perished during the revolution, either from violence or the disease and famine it brought. That was about 1 in 8 Mexicans. The revolution eventually wound down in the 1920s, though exactly when it ended is debated. What emerged was a new Mexican state enshrined in the Constitution of 1917, which included groundbreaking provisions for labor rights, land reform, and nationalization of resources. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, came to dominate Mexican politics for the rest of the 20th century, holding the presidency from 1929 to 2000. That's 71 years of one-party rule, though Mexico technically had elections and other parties. Throughout the 20th century, Mexico continued to grapple with its identity. The government promoted a nationalism based on mestizaje, celebrating the mixture of indigenous and Spanish heritage. Muralists like Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros created massive public artworks depicting Mexican history in all its complexity and struggle. The films of the golden age of Mexican cinema in the 1940s and 50s spread Mexican culture throughout Latin America. Writers like Octavio Paz, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, explored what it meant to be Mexican. Mexico nationalized its oil industry in 1938, asserting economic sovereignty. It maintained an independent foreign policy, often at odds with the United States despite being neighbors. So here we are today. Mexico is the 11th most populous country in the world, with about 130 million people. It's a complex, vibrant democracy with all the challenges that come with that. It has the 15th largest economy globally. Mexican culture, the food, the music, the art, the celebrations, has spread worldwide. Day of the Dead, which blends indigenous beliefs about honoring ancestors with Catholic All Saints' Day, has become recognized internationally. Mexican cuisine was declared intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. Mexican soccer, telenovelas, and music genres from mariachi to regional Mexican to rock and Espanol are consumed globally. But Mexico still struggles with inequality, with corruption, with violence related to drug cartels. It still navigates a complicated relationship with the United States. It still works to honor and include its indigenous communities who were there long before the Aztecs and who continue to maintain distinct languages and cultures. About 25 million Mexicans still speak an indigenous language today. From the Mexico wanderers who built an empire on a lake to the Spanish colonial period that created a new cultural synthesis, to the struggle for independence and the long road to democracy. Mexico's story is one of resilience, of cultural fusion, of survival and reinvention. It's a story of a place and a people who have been conquered, mixed, divided, and transformed, but who have emerged with a distinct identity that's recognizable anywhere in the world. When you see the Mexican flag with its eagle devouring a serpent while perched on a cactus, you're seeing a symbol that connects directly back to the founding myth of Tenochtitlan. That symbol has survived conquests, revolutions, transformations. It's made the journey from Aztec legend to modern national identity. That's not just continuity. That's deep cultural DNA that refuses to be erased. And that, my friends, is the story of how Mexico came to be. From an empire on a lake to a modern nation of over 100 million people. From Aztec pyramids to Spanish cathedrals to modern skyscrapers, all layered on top of each other in Mexico City. From Nahuatl to Spanish to the countless other languages spoken across the country. It's a story that's still being written, still evolving, still surprising us. Because Mexico isn't just a place where ancient and modern collide. It's a place where they fuse into something entirely its own, and that's what makes it absolutely fascinating.